People who grew up rich, when did you realize you were living in a bubble and not like everyone else? I'm not super rich. But things really hit home when I was with a friend and his mother started to panic because she couldn't afford milk for her toddler son, my friend's little brother. I was just walking around with $40 in my pocket for no real reason, so I gave her $20. She was embarrassed to be taking money from a 13-year-old, but swallowed her pride for the sake of her children. I knew my friend wasn't as well off, but it never fully hit me what that meant before then. To me, being poor just meant someone couldn't afford nice things. What it meant to struggle with basic necessities like milk never really struck me before then. I did not grow up rich, but my husband did. His sister once said I didn't know everyone didn't live in big houses until I went off to college. Apparently she led a very sheltered life. When I went to college and had friends who were complaining about student loans. Same here. I remember when I started seeing a girl at uni and she said she had loans. I asked her why she didn't just ask her parents for money. Grew up a lot that day. When I started talking in school about the pros and cons of Disney World vs Disneyland, and people were like, "Yeah, I've been on vacation." LUCKYY. Conversely, I remember a summer where me and my mom lived in a car and I thought it was the coolest thing. Turns out we were just homeless. Meanwhile in university there was a guy who didn't understand why we didn't all have our own condos right by the school. He also never understood why we didn't have money to go to Mexico on reading break and would just tell us to ask for a bigger allowance from our trust. He learned to just stop talking after someone fed him a left hook when he made a comment about how stupid we are for taking out student loans and not just paying tuition up front. Wasn't rich but realized I was far better off than I was led to believe when I tried filling out FAFSA forms to go to college. My mother freaked when I told her I needed income information. Turns out, she'd been lying about our financial state for years and didn't want to see any of that money spent on college for any of her 5 kids. I found out that we were far poorer than I'd believed when I finally convinced my dad I needed our tax info to fill out the FAFSA. He was straight up refusing to give it to me for a while. I was about 12, I think. When friends would come over they would go on and on about how big the house was and how I had more games and computers and shit than them. They especially seemed freaked out about the maid, and I just started to realize that I didn't have the same circumstances as most. They wouldn't all say it if it weren't true. I assume. I did have other friends with money, especially when I started attending private school. But I didn't realize they were well off either. When a school friend came over and asked, "How many families live here?" and it was just our house, I was 8. And I was embarrassed. The first time I went to my best friend's house, his circumstances were the exact opposite. His parents tried their best, but his dad often didn't have much work during the winter, and his mom didn't work outside of the home. They had 6 kids, and usually had things like pancakes for dinner. I'm in an upper class part of DC, with every toy and electronic imaginable, and he had none. It was a good lesson for me to learn, but it was a shame that it was at the expense of a person I loved so very much. I was in your friend's position growing up and now my kids are in your position. I'm hoping my kids learn how well they have things comparatively. Are you still friends with that person? This isn't a great response because I didn't grow up rich, but rather very poor. I feel like I should share though. I met my first best friend in grade 6. When she brought me to her home I was flabbergasted. They had a vacuum that plugged into their walls. They could even vacuum downstairs with it. She had a trampoline and box I begged each time to play with both. She had a small alcove with a mini fridge that was full with ice pop and different sodas. That was cool. I remember thinking I should take more than one because I wouldn't get another chance. When they invited me over for dinner her mom always made me take extra because I was nervous to ask for seconds. I couldn't believe the amount of food in the house. And we all would have a huge glass of milk with dinner. Milk was always a treat and being able to drink as much as I wanted was so overwhelming. I just remember being astounded by everything, and 3 years later they adopted me. I was talking to a friend about going to the town's public beach and they were saying how horribly crowded it gets in summer. And I suddenly realized, I was well into my 20s, that I had never had to go to a public beach because I always had at least 2 private family beaches to go to. One with cabanas, outdoor showers and space for cooking. I always had taken it for granted. Not rich, but in high school, there was this one kid who wore the same shoes from sophomore to senior year. I kept telling him to buy a new pair, but he would claim that they were broken in and he didn't want to waste money on uncomfortable ones. I decided to do that thing where the class would surprise him with a new pair of Vans for his birthday. But when I asked our classmates to chip in, they all said they didn't have any money to spare. That didn't make sense because most of them had after school jobs. That's when I found out I was the only kid in class who wasn't working to help support their own family. Edit, I ended up getting him the shoes on my own. More upper middle class. Since I started using Reddit, especially reading AskReddit posts, I've been realizing more and more every day how fortunate I am. Same here. Makes me really appreciate my parents. They're not perfect, but they beat a lot of these other parents by a lot. And they care a ton. Sometimes too much. I have a family member that grew up with a private jet. The first time she flew commercial, she turned to her family and asked, "Who are all these people on our plane?" On flying, I'm no way rich, but I was reading that the majority of the world's population, over 90%, didn't take one flight last year. I'm not sure if that's true. I'll look for the post. But that hit me pretty hard how fortunate I am to fly to see family sometimes. My uncle was in a famous rock band. We didn't have a ton growing up, but whenever I went to my uncle's it was always super fun with all the toys and snacks he'd get me. He wasn't crazy with his money. His favorite restaurant was the Waffle House, but his home was on the beach. Nice cars, etc. So I recognized the wealth. It wasn't until I was like 8 years old that I realized not everyone was related to a celebrity. He died a couple years ago and my heart still hurts. In terms of raw cash flow, my parents were never rich. They were just teachers. However, they were international teachers, so I got to see and do things many people have on their bucket list by the time I was 18. I definitely had a very privileged upbringing, if not a rich one. I was kinda aware of it, but it never really hit home till my first year living back in the States, where people just didn't know about so much of the world. Define growing up rich. My dad didn't start making real money until I was at least 10 or 11. We were comfortably middle class before that. I guess it started when we moved to a new city and people in my school would openly tease me about being rich. I think the first thing I started noticing was that we took a big annual family vacation, usually on a plane, while many of my friends have never flown before. I grew up middle class. When I was in 5th grade I spent the night with a girlfriend. In the morning I remember asking what was for breakfast, and I remember seeing my friend's face. I then realized the kitchen was literally empty. The dad came in and gave us a small package of those small white donuts from the gas station for in the package. I felt so embarrassed that I asked. We had a great day hanging out, but I learned what poverty was that day. When my dad bought me a house to live in rent-free, no mortgage, and realizing that most people don't holiday in the Algarve twice a year, my house is now a hostel safe space for anyone I'm friends with close to who needs a place to stay. When I went to my friend's house when I was about 8, that was the first time it sunk in that 15,000 SQFT houses weren't normal. Holy shit. 15,000? That's not a house. That's a mansion. Yes. It's actually in a bunch of architectural books because it was built in like the 1920s or some shit. We had 3 pools, a giant spread of land, and an attached 5,000 SQFT house where the help lived. I grew up thinking that was normal until I went to a buddy's house that was like 2,500 SQFT and I couldn't figure out where the rest of it was. The first time I met other kids who didn't have domestic household staff. I remember not understanding why they didn't have people to maintain their household. I wouldn't call my family rich by our standards, but upper middle class. So rich by world population standards. My dad grew up super poor though, so he made sure he understood how lucky we were. But to be honest, I didn't really understand until my teenage years when he took me to Costa Rica to visit where my older brother had lived for a couple years. We didn't go to the beach or touristy spots, and I got a much better idea of what poverty can look like. It made me really appreciate the luck I had being born into the family I was born into. I try to keep it in mind as I go through life, and hope my kids learn not to take their luck for granted either. It's a pet peeve of mine when people are born into wealth and act like their own wealth is 100% from their hard work. Sure, they may work hard, but never discount how much easier they had it than others born into poverty. I worked to pay for my undergraduate degree, but if I hadn't been able to one semester, my parents could have bailed me out. I don't know if they would have, but knowing they could have made it substantially less stressful. I grew up upper middle class. Not private jet rich, but definitely was able to enjoy life's luxuries, nice vacations, newer products, etc. Honestly, I think it was the small things that were a lot bigger for other people. I never really cared much about the price of a meal. I simply ordered based on whatever sounded the best. Add on some sides? Sure. Why not? Same thing with driving. I always volunteered to be the driver on long trips because I never really thought much about swiping my card for gas. Just fill up and go. No need to check my account. I definitely realized in college that a lot of people didn't have that privilege. I have a rich friend and he found out he was rich when I asked him why he buys a new car like every 2 months. Slightly exaggerated. Him. Engine light was on. Me. And they couldn't fix it. Him. Fix it? I thought that meant it's broken. I just got a new one. I had to explain to him that normally people get their car checked out first when something's wrong and only buy a new one when the repair costs more than the car. When I became poor, I'm the daughter of a single mum who's always had a good job and is good with money in general. We took trips all around Europe every year. We're European, so nothing too fancy. She bought a new car on a regular basis. We would go to theme parks, cinemas, theaters, zoo and all sorts of other exciting things very often. We weren't super rich and I wasn't spoiled, but I had a good life and I took all of these things for granted. I eventually chose a wrong career and lived off of welfare benefits for a couple of years. I now work a job that pays less than minimum wage. I currently have €80 to my name until tomorrow. Having a car and taking vacations seems super unrealistic to me now. When I stopped being well off, we were upper middle class and had a very large nice house in a fancy part of town. Had a pool and all that. We took regular trips to Cancun or Jamaica etc. I had every toy I ever asked for the most part, and nice clothes. I was very spoiled as an only child. My parents divorced and their money got split in half, and so we no longer had the money to live in that neighborhood or have a house that big or fancy. My mom could not afford to buy me designer or name brand clothing anymore. Money got tighter. I started getting made fun of by my former friends for not having nice clothes or things or living near them. Former friends dumped me. Turned me from Regina, Georgia into a loser, I guess. It was a hard fall. I learnt at 21 that people have water meters. Some people actually put money into the side of the box and get water and electricity like pay as you go. I'm not rich by any means, but I realized how privileged I was that day and I haven't taken anything for granted since. I know some people like this where they think they are out of the bubble, but never ate ramen noodles for 3 months to survive. I don't think they will ever realize what it's like to live without a blanket of financial security. When I realized the poor neighborhoods were actually very nice, safe, middle class neighborhoods and not in fact poor areas. Grad school. I wasn't really even aware of how wealthy my dad was until recently. But he did a pretty good job of raising me with a middle class outlook. My high school ran from pretty poor to upper middle class. So I never stood out. College. I lived pretty normally. And I was on a major scholarship. So loans weren't an issue anyway. When I started my PhD program and he bought a ducking house for me to live in, it was an eye-opener. The other people in my program are generally renting, sharing a place with other grad students, and trying to get by on a stipend that means they can scrape by if they're frugal. I don't have any expenses for housing and own my car outright. And that means my stipend feels pretty damn generous.